Hi friends, it's Chari. Today I am back with some more Build-A-Cake cakes, and today we are making some Halloween cakes. So I have 3 different Halloween cakes to share with you today, and of course every one of them starts with the Build-A-Cake and the Build-A-Cake add-on. So you already saw the pieces die cut there. I am using the Build-A-Jack-O-Lantern die set for one of the pumpkins and the guts and the scoop and the knife, and I'm also using the stitched pumpkin frame and the outside in stitched pumpkin for some of those elements, especially this big jack-o'-lantern face. So I am going to cut faces out of my cake and my pumpkin. I'm making the cake look like a jack-o'-lantern. That is the idea. And they're going to be in a pumpkin patch. So I have my little pumpkin here. I cut that shorter kind of squatty pumpkin from the Build a Jack-o'-lantern set, and I have my main cake, and both of these are cut from different shades of orange from the textured canvas red and orange pack. And since we have that kind of traditional jack-o'-lantern face that I'm going to cut out of the cake, which is that big face there, I decided to go with one of the different faces for the jack-o'-lantern itself. So I do have the ganache cut from some green, and I'm just using that as a guide to figure out where I want this face. I'm cutting it kind of to the right and a little bit tilted, and that will give me space for my other jack-o'-lantern to be placed on the left side. Now I cut out that little solid piece that fills in the face for the jack-o'-lantern, and I cut this from some black sparkle cardstock so that it catches the light when you see the faces. And you can also see I have an entire cake to the left there cut out of that same black sparkle cardstock, and that is what I'm going to layer behind my pumpkin cake. So of course I want to use liquid glue for this because I am gluing to that glitter and it is a rough surface. So I want to make sure it stays adhered. And I'll just line that up, and now I have those glittery faces for my jack-o'-lanterns. Now I did want to do a little inking, and I could have done this before I added the face, but I just kind of forgot. I'm using some pumpkin spice ink to just pull that ink up from the bottom and give it a little shadow at the bottom so that the color is a little ombre and not so solid. I'm doing the same on this little pumpkin, but he was such a darker orange that it didn't show up very much, so I pulled out some chili pepper ink, and now I'm adding a little bit of darkness to the bottom of him as well. Now for this ganache, if I line it up where it's supposed to be, it kind of covers up his eye a little bit. So what I'm actually going to do is move it up and make a slightly taller cake. So I'm going to use liquid glue so I can kind of shift it around. I'm lining it up where it should be, and then I'm going to shift it up until that little line that is the edge of the cake doesn't show. So I kind of figured out exactly where it needed to be to not show under the highest part of that ganache. Now I also have a stem and a leaf from the outside in stitched pumpkin. These are cut from other shades of green. I am coming in with some jalapeno ink, adding a little bit of shading to the top of the ganache before I add the stem and the leaf. And these are just cut from some other shades of green. This is all from the Textured Canvas Green pack. And of course, I also have a little stem for my little jack-o'-lantern as well. And I will just add that to the top of that jack-o'-lantern. Now for the cake plate, I decided to go with something a little more neutral, so I'm using some narwhal cardstock for the cake plate. And then I need this little guy on the side to be a solid piece. And also I have the pumpkin guts there. I'm going to add the little seeds by opening up those openings with a pokey tool. And I cut this from a yellow colored cardstock, and then the seeds are cut from dolphin cardstock. So it's kind of that warm gray, pale warm gray color. And I'm just going to tuck each of those seeds in those little slots. You can see I added the little dots of glue. That's going to hold them in place. And I'm just putting all 3 of those little seeds in there and making sure they're in kind of different directions, because this is of course the pumpkin guts that came out of the pumpkin. All right, I need to also assemble some of the tools from the Build-A-Jack-O-Lantern set. I have the knife here. I cut this from some silver metallic cardstock, and then the handle is Storm Cloud. It actually cuts two handles, so you can layer them, one on the front and the back, and give it some kind of heftiness to it. And then I also have the scoop cut from that same silver metallic cardstock. Now, initially I wanted my card to be landscape, but you're going to see that I actually changed it. But for now, I thought it was going to be landscape, and I'm going to make a nighttime sky. So I'm using the nighttime sky stencils, which has this mask for the moon. So I use some removable adhesive runner to hold that mask in place. I am doing all my inking on some Bristol Smooth cardstock, and piece is actually bigger than a card base. I will be trimming it down. And I'm using my Distress Oxides. I started out with Salvage Patina, which is that lightest color that I put all around the edge of the moon. Now I'm coming in with Peacock Feathers. And I'm just going around that same circular kind of shape of the moon, blending between those two colors. And then I'm going to go back to that Salvage Patina and kind of blend them more. It'll pull that lighter color into the darker color a little bit and smooth out the transition. Next, I pulled out Uncharted Mariner, which is this very dark blue color. And this looks really stark right now, but it looks beautiful when you blend the colors together. So I'm just finishing off the rest of this panel with Uncharted Mariner, getting a nice layer of that ink on there, and then I will go back to my Peacock Feathers and blend between the two. And then finally, I did pull out black soot and add a little bit to the edges. I kind of forgot that this panel was bigger than it needs to be, and I'm going to be trimming it down. So I don't know how much of this black soot you actually saw in the end, but I wanted to leave this in here so that you saw the really cool look that it creates. You know, kind of that where the moon is where the light is, and it goes off into the darkness of night on the edges. And then you can just blend that out with the other colors. I love how the oxide kind of moves really well on the Bristol cardstock. So now I can remove my mask. And I did clean up my work surface so I don't have any of that blue ink on there. I'm going to make sure that adhesive is gone. And then I can pull out the nighttime stencil that has the opening for the moon. And I will add some color to our moon. So I am using Squeeze Lemonade for the majority of the moon. And what I tried to do with this is only put my ink on the edge and kind of go towards white up in that corner. So I didn't do the whole moon yellow. I wanted different shades of yellow in there. And you do want to make sure that you don't get in any of those other openings, so I just got a piece of scrap paper to help me mask that off. Now I'm moving it to where I have one of those openings that is the craters of the moon, and I am using Wild Honey Distress Oxide ink for those craters, just to add some more texture to that moon. Now what I did do once I was done, I had a little bit of a white line there, but I also wanted that line to be a little more soft and not so hard. So I went back in with the Salvage Patina and the Squeeze Lemonade and just went around the curve of that moon to just soften up that line between the two colors. Then I have a stitch rectangle. This is the largest of these stitch rectangles, so this is going to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And here is where I decided I was going to turn my design to be portrait instead of landscape. Now I'm adding my gold splatters all over the background now that it is cut with that stitch rectangle. You did get some of that black at the bottom, but I actually do end up covering that up with a piece of cardstock as well. Next, I wanted to add some black splatters to my spooky sky, so I just took that black soot Distress Oxide and squished it down on my craft mat, added a little bit of water, and before I started splattering, I remembered I don't want these on the moon. I want that to remain just with the gold, and so I'm laying that mask back over the moon to protect it and adding those spooky black splatters all over the sky. When you flick it off the block, you get those little splatters, and then you can add some bigger droplets by just tapping your brush. So I'll set that aside to dry, and now I need a ground for my pumpkin to sit on. And I cut it with that same stitch rectangle and then measured how far up I needed to cut it. So I have about an inch. And I decided this was a little too bright for my nighttime scene, so I'm taking that same black soot distress oxide and I'm going to darken up this piece of noble fir cardstock. And that fits kind of the spooky pumpkin patch a little bit better. Now I did notice I had some splatters of just water, so I decided to embrace that and pick up that ink with a paper towel, and then I actually added some more splatters of just water and picked that up as well. So I have some lighter spots in my sky too. Now that this background is all dry, I'm adding it to my card base. And then I will add my ground here at the bottom. And when I'm adhering to something that I've put this pigment oxide ink on, I like to use liquid glue. I also want to stamp my sentiments, so I put everything on there to figure out the placement. I'm using Happy Halloween. This is actually from Sweet Spiders, but there are many sets that have a Happy Halloween sentiment. And when I'm stamping on an oxide ink like this, because it's kind of pigment and sitting there, I want to use a pigment ink for my sentiment. So I'm using some VersaFine Onyx Black for that. Now, once I got this all together, I felt like the ground needed some splatters too. So I have my white splatter paint and I'm just going to add some texture to the ground. Everything was textured except the ground and it just kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. So now I am ready to add my pumpkins. And I'm just going to add these directly to the background, or at least this big cake, and try and center it up. I think that looks great with that big giant moon. I'm going to lay a block on it so it dries nice and flat. And then here's where I want to make this pumpkin one piece. So I actually cut out this face piece in black before I decided to use the sparkle cardstock. So I'm just going to utilize that and use it as a backer to hold the bottom part and the top part of my pumpkin together as one piece. So for the pumpkin guts, I'm using some thin foam squares so it can kind of be popped up a little bit from that cake. I have the little scoop. I'm not exactly sure where I want that to be just yet. And then I have my other pumpkin. So I'm just figuring out the placement of things. I like this pumpkin on the left. He overhangs a little bit. And I have the knife. Once I figure out where I want things to go, I will start to glue them down. So for the scoop, I am going to have this kind of sticking up like it's stuck into the pumpkin guts. And then I'm adding my little knife to my pumpkin here, and then I will use some foam squares to pop him up as well, so he has some dimension off the big pumpkin cake behind him. Now I also have some of these little curly tendrils. This is also from the Outside In Stitch Pumpkin and the Stitch Pumpkin frame. I cut these from that same dark green cardstock as the stem, and I'm just adding a few of these to the cake to decorate it a little bit more. So I've got 3 of them. This one's going to come up out the back, and I'm gluing that directly on to the background. I did cut some out of brown, but decided that I did not need to use them. Now, I know I use stickles all the time. I do not use colored stickles except for Halloween, and I love these bright green firefly stickles. This is the one time a year I break them out, so I need to add some fluorescent green stickles to my pumpkin. I love it on that green ganache, the stems and everything, and then I'll use my stardust stickles for the seeds and just a little bit on the edges of the moon so it sparkles. And then here is my finished Halloween pumpkin patch cake with that little pumpkin companion with him. So next up, I'm making a spooky cake, and of course, I have my Build-A-Cake dies to start with. This one is going to be a 2-tiered cake, so I cut the large tier and the small tier. I've cut all of my other little elements, like the icing for the top and the bottom, and some decorative stuff. And then I pulled out a bunch of Halloween dies. So I will be using pieces from the Spooky Forest, the little ghost and the grass. I'm using the moon, the trees, and the gate and the bat from the Shadowbox Halloween add-on. From Build-A-House Halloween add-on, I really just used that tiny little spider web because it was the perfect size. And then I also pulled out the Scallop Treat Box Halloween add-on and I cut out the cat. So here are all my pieces. I cut a whole bunch out and I sort of had a plan, but not 100%. So it's going to be really fun to build this. And these are all cut from shades of the gray textured canvas cardstock pack. So we have a light gray, a dark gray, and black. And then I'm also using the Spooktacular stamp set. This is an older stamp set, but these little tombstones were the perfect size. So I stamped those on that darker gray, and I'm just going to fussy cut those out. There are coordinating dies, but I want this to be right up against that stamped image. It'll help it match all the die cut pieces I have just a little bit better. Here is the moon that I cut from the Shadow Box add-on, and I cut this from speckled eggshell cardstock, and I'm just using that same blending tool that I used on the first card. I'm not even getting my ink pad back out, but I added some squeezed lemonade and some wild honey distress oxides to the edge of this moon to give it that nice yellow glow. Look how pretty that is. I love the little craters that the die creates. So let's start to assemble this cake. So the main bodies of the cake are my lighter gray. The plate is black. And the little topper pieces with the little scallop details, those are going to be a dark gray. I wanted this to be all very monochromatic and spooky looking, and then we're going to have a really colorful background. Now this little spider web is from the Build-A-House add-on, and it is the perfect size. I'm going to tuck it up underneath that topper piece on this little small layer, and we're going to have this glittery spider web. Now for this cute little spider web, I wanted a tiny spider. So the tiny Halloween stamp set has the tiniest spider, and I am going to stamp this spider onto my cake. So I just kind of selectively inked it, stamped it like it's coming down from that topper part of the cake. And you're actually going to see me stamp this spider a couple more times on this cake as I start to assemble it. We have our little icing detail that goes along the bottom. And I'm going to add one to the top piece too. Now to add it to the top one, you just cut off two of those little icing swirls and then it fits this top piece perfectly. And this is where I decided, oh, I think I need another spider. This one looked perfect until I added the icing and now he feels like he's too low. So I'm going to add a second one that is a little bit higher, and now it looks like we have some friends with this little spider web. Now I'm adding my small layer to the big layer so that I have my whole cake to work with now. And I can start to add my embellishments to this really big bottom layer. And I cut that little detail piece from some silver sparkle cardstock. You are going to see me add it here in a minute. I'm adding this little gate first. This is from the Shadow Box Halloween add-on. I trimmed off the fat part that's on the side. And I cut this from that same black sparkle cardstock. So now we kind of have a sparkly thing on the right side on the little tier and a sparkly thing on the left side on the bottom tier, creating that diagonal design across our cake. Now I can add this little detail, and I actually want it behind the gate. So I'm just pulling up that gate, and I will add little dots of glue to the little dots of this icing detail and slide that in there behind that black glitter gate. Then I can stick that back down. And now we're moving on to our ghost. So I did cut the ghost out of pixie dust, that white sparkle cardstock. These added some great pops of white onto this cake, and I just love the way it turned out. There is a solid piece that you can layer behind to fill in the eyes and the mouth with black. And that's what I'm doing here. There is a third ghost up there. I do end up using that third ghost here in a little bit. But at first I decided to add the trees to the top. I knew I wanted spooky trees on the top of this cake. I wasn't sure if I was going to find one the right size, but that Shadow Box Halloween add-on had two tiny trees and they were perfect. So these were just cut from black cardstock, so we do have some contrast between that dark gray cake. I also have my little tombstones. I'm adding those at the bottom as well. I like tucking these images onto the sides of the cake. And of course, one little ghost, he's going to peek up from behind the tombstones. I knew I wanted the moon kind of floating up here behind the trees. So I will add a little bit of glue to the back of that big tree and just pick up the moon. And of course, the bats. One needs to be flying across the moon. These are also cut from that black sparkle cardstock. So I think that it really makes those black bats stand out with that sparkle. And I was trying to figure out where to add another ghost and decided this would be the perfect placement up at the top. I have two different sizes of bats. They're not starkly different in size, but one is a little bit bigger. So I just cut a bunch. I wasn't sure how many I would use. Now my cat, initially I wanted him peeking out from behind the tombstones, but he kind of got lost. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with him, but I found a really great place to put him eventually. Now these little grasses, these are from the Spooky Forest backdrop, and they are tiny. They are perfectly sized for this project. And they are also cut from the black sparkle cardstock. I have 4 of them and I'm just tucking them around the cake. You could put as many as you wanted. They work great down here with the tombstones and the gate. Now back to this cat. I decided that I wanted him peeking out from behind the cake, and I just thought that was the perfect place for him. He is a little bit bigger than a lot of these images, but peeking out from the side was perfect. And then I have my third little ghost. I needed one more pop of white on here, so I am tucking him down here at the gate. We kind of have that rule of 3 with those ghosts. And I'm just trimming off the very end of his tail so I can tuck him behind that icing a little bit better. And these are all the same ghosts, so they're all pointed the same direction, but I'm just shifting him a little bit so he isn't an exact copy of the one beside him. I had one more bat, decided to add that on there because we don't want to waste a perfectly good glitter bat. And then here is basically my finished cake. I did add one more little spider to the bottom level. So now to move on to my background, this is again a piece of smooth Bristol cardstock. This is cut a bit bigger than I need it to be. And I'm using Distress Oxides. I'm starting with Wild Honey, and I'm going to make a gradient from one side to the other. I wanted this background to be nice and bright and bold because I have a cake that is all grays and blacks, and I wanted the background to really help that cake stand out. And instead of doing traditional purple or orange, I went back to a card I made quite a few years ago and decided to make a background with the same colors. So I have Wild Honey, I have Carved Pumpkin, next I have Crackling Campfire, which is this really red orange, which is just beautiful. And I feel like it's kind of an unexpected Halloween color because it's so red. And I'm just going back and forth and blending the colors together. And then finally, the last color I used was Seedless Preserves. So let me clean up this orange a little bit here so I don't pick up that big blob. I'm using a piece of scrap paper just to keep my fingerprints off as I blend. And I'm pulling in that purple from the other side. And that purple is a red purple, so it works really well with these other colors. Look at that beautiful ombre look and how much that cake really pops off that colorful background. Now I want to add some texture to this, so I'm using the stitched ripple backdrop to cut out this inked piece. This gives those little stitching details, and it's going to cut it out to be 4¼ by 5½ to fit on my card. After I cut it out, I went in with black soot, and I'm going to dingy this up a little bit because that was a beautiful background, but we have a spooky cake, so we need to make this background a little more spooky. I also love how that black soot just catches in those stitching lines and you can really see them stand out. And I'm making sure that this is kind of haphazard and spooky looking. I don't want solid black. It kind of looks like clouds, like ghosty clouds. Next, of course, we've got a splatter because this is a Halloween card, and what is a Halloween card without some splatter? So I'm using white metallic. This is going to kind of absorb in and just give us the slightest bit of shimmer. I'm also using some white splatter paint. And I'm not really too concerned about the center there where I did not get the black soot. That's all going to be covered up by my cake. So it looks a little crazy right now, but it's going to look great in the end. And then, of course, some black splatters. I love splattering in multiple colors. I really think it gives it a lot of texture and makes it very dynamic in the background. So while that background dries, I'm going to stamp a sentiment inside my card. This cake takes up the whole front of the card, and I did not want to try and squeeze a sentiment in there and distract. So I am using Henry's Build-A-Sentiment Fall to spell out May Your Halloween Be. And then I wanted to make it say Spooktacular. And there is a stamp in the Spooktacular stamp set that says that, but I thought I would spell it out with Henry's Jr.'s ABCs so that my font matched and I just had some bigger words. So I used those to spell it out. I always like to test stamp it. Then I'm going to pick up the other words and I will test stamp those as well. Everything looks great. And now I can stamp this on the inside of my card. Perfect. I think that's so cute. Now I'm ready to add my background to my card because it's nice and dry. And then I can add my beautiful cake. So I want this cake to be popped up off this background. I'm going to add foam all over the back. I cut some of these little squares in half so I could put them behind the cat and the trees and the bat's wing. Make sure everything is nice and supported on the card. Then I pulled off all those liner papers, and as you can see, this really does take up the whole card, especially with that moon at the top. So this is why I put that sentiment inside. And of course, I'm adding a little more glitter to the moon and to some of those icing details. I do have a lot of glitter going on with the bats and the gate and the spider webs, but just a little bit more on some of these images looks great. And then here is my finished spooky cake card. I love this card so much. That background is beautiful. And I love all these little elements coming together to make such a detailed and decorative, fun Halloween cake. I really do think it's fun to find all the bits and pieces and bring them together for something special. Then my last cake today is candy themed. So this is my trick or treat cake. And I have cut all these candies and my cakes. All these candies are from the Build-A-Cauldron set. So we have lollipops and candies, we have swirls, we have candy corn, and there's also these little tiny candies and of course the treat bucket from the Build-A-Critter costume set. And that's going to help set the scene. Now I do need to work on my cake a little bit and cut these pieces apart. I'm making a 3-layered cake that looks like candy corn, as you can tell. I cut each one out of a solid cake. Then I'm going to take the die that cuts them into 3 and line it up. I'm doing yellow first. This is going to be the bottom layer of my cake. And to make sure it's cut in the same place every time, I'm going to show you my little trick. So here are the 3 pieces of the yellow cake. I only need the bottom. What I'm going to do is line this up on the orange, which is the next layer. This is going to be the center. And to make sure that cut is in the same place, I'm going to line this up and butt the die right up against the yellow, hold it in place with tape, remove the yellow, and run that through my die cut machine. And now I know the center piece is going to fit perfectly right above that yellow piece. Now I need to do the same with the white, of course, but I'm going to work backwards for this one. Instead of trying to stack the yellow and orange and hold them in place, I'm just going to take the leftover orange piece that's the top and do the same thing and butt the die right up against it, hold it in place with the tape, and now I know the top part is going to be perfectly cut. So now I have my 3-layer cake. I also have a solid cake so I can glue all these layers to that cake when I'm ready. But first I want to cut some sprinkles out of the center so that I can layer some orange glitter behind it. So I've cut the sprinkle layer out of the center, and then I realized I need to actually cut this to be the same size too. So I will use my cake so I get it the right width. And now I can use the die that cut the layers and make sure it is the right shape. This way I know that this will fit right behind that orange layer of cake. It won't overlap into the yellow or the white. So now I can take that solid cake and put some adhesive all over it, and I will start to layer my cake pieces together. So I have the yellow at the bottom. Next, I'm going to do the sparkle, which actually once I glued it together, this had a really cool look too, but I still wanted the sprinkle look through the center because I have a lot of glitter going on this card too. For the topper, I wanted it to remain white but look a little bit different, so I cut that from some pixie dust sparkle cardstock. And then to add the solid cardstock layer with the sprinkles cut out, which I kind of got a little close to the right side. I was looking to see if I could cut some more sprinkles where I felt like I had a dead space on the left side, but I'm just going to use my candies and my embellishments to cover up the sprinkles being a little bit to one side. It's just an opportunity for embellishment. But you want to make sure you use liquid glue because we are gluing this onto that sparkle cardstock and it is kind of rough and uneven. So we want to make sure that glue sticks. For the plate, I'm pulling in another bright color. This is going to be a very colorful Halloween card with all the candies. I've got the purple and the green, the yellow, the orange, all the typical Halloween colors. For the icing detail at the bottom, this is that same pixie dust cardstock, which is the top. Here is that little pumpkin treat bucket from the Build-A-Critter costumes. This is going to be one of my main focal points on the top of the cake. And then I have a lot of candy here. So I just cut a bunch of candies from the Build-A-Cauldron set. I have some lollipops. The sticks are cut from dolphin cardstock, so they are different than the white. And then the wrappers for the candies I cut from pearlescent vellum, so they really look like a wrapper when they pop out from behind the colorful candy in the middle. So I'm just adding all these with liquid glue, just making all of my candies assembled there. And there's the little candies. Those are from the Build-A-Critter costume set as well. Now I thought about figuring out where these all go, but it felt like a hot mess. So I just decided to start going for it. Just start figuring out what looked good. So I'm starting at the bottom with these little candies that are fallen down and tucked at the bottom. Now the top has a lot more going on. So what I'm going to do is start with my focal point, which is that treat bucket. Then I thought it would be fun for these lollipops to be popping out of the treat bucket. So I'm tucking a purple one in there and gluing it to the lid. I am going to add some more glue because I kind of moved this around and it wasn't quite set yet. Then I'll add some candies around it. I do end up adding another lollipop into the treat bucket because this is a good opportunity to create some height because all these candies are small and low, but if we can stack these lollipops, it'll give it some height there on the right side of the cake. And then of course now I'm pulling in those little candies. These are great to kind of fill in. I think having these little tiny candies really helped because then you could fill it, but they weren't all exactly the same and it was a little less repetitive. They are also great to kind of tuck over here where I'm trying to embellish where my sprinkles were a little bit shifted to the right. And I did cut some of those little candies out of some purple glitter cardstock, which is a different shade of purple than the solid, which was a really nice contrast, I feel like, having those two different purples in there. So this cake is really getting nice and filled with candy. I decided I needed to pull out those little swirls I had cut. These are also from the Build-A-Cauldron die set. I just cut them out of the sparkle cardstock I was using. So I have an orange, a green, and a purple, and I'm just going to figure out where to kind of tuck these. I think this really makes it look very whimsical. I could see this in a candy shop with all these kind of swirls around. And this gives it some more height, some additional embellishment that isn't just candies. So I'm tucking some in behind the sides as well, and I'll actually add some more once I get this on the card. So here is my finished cake for right now, but I am going to add some more things because guess what? I forgot I cut a bunch of candy corn. Here they are. I set them in this little bowl so I didn't lose all these tiny pieces and I forgot to put them together. So we're going to assemble these little candy corns together. This is from that Build-A-Cauldron set. And I have all these little pieces in the bowl. I'm just going to layer them onto the solid piece and make some candy corn for our candy corn cake. So I did struggle a little bit figuring out where I wanted to put them because when you put them down on the cake itself, the colors kind of blend in because they're the same colors as the candy corn. So I did finally figure out where to put them to where there was enough contrast to where we saw them, and I really do think that they added a lot to the cake. They kind of did all end up on the left side, but I think it works. Every time I tried to find a place for that one on the right side, it just didn't work out for me. It aesthetically wasn't pleasing to me. I decided to pull in another little swirl and add this directly onto the cake. And now onto the background. So I'm using some spiffy speckles. This is the purpley color. So we're not doing our ink blending like the others. I figured I'd show you a slightly easier background on this card. I'm going to trim this out with the largest of the outside in stitch rectangles. I think that looks pretty good with that cake, but I did want to add a little bit of stenciling. I wanted to add some interest to the background, so I pulled out the spiderweb stencil. I'm going to use my grip mat to hold my paper in place. I want the spider web to be up in the top left corner. The stencil is kind of in the center. So what I'm going to do is take my Wilted Violet Distress Ink and very light-handed stencil from the center out so that the spider web fades out to nothing. So when I pull this away, I have that very subtle spider web. It's not going to distract from my cake. I also went with the Wilted Violet and just kind of darkened up all the edges a little bit so that the bottom matched the top a little more. And my panel looked a little bit more uniform versus just having inking at the top. So I will add this pattern paper to the card base. Since I cut this out with the largest of the outside in stitch rectangles, I'm going to have that little white border all the way around it, which frames it up nicely. And then for the sentiment, I am using Henry's Build-A-Sentiment Fall to spell out the sentiment trick or treat, which goes perfectly with a trick or treat cake. I have a stitch sentiment banner cut from narwhal cardstock. I've already treated it with my anti-static powder tool so that I can white emboss the sentiment. So I will stamp this with some clear embossing ink, add my white embossing powder, and then I will use my heat tool. I always like to kind of heat the back of the banner first and then move my heat to the front and melt that powder till we get that bright white sentiment. So I have my foam squares added on the back. I'm adding my sentiment strip first, and I just have my cake here for placement. Then I will add foam all over the back of my cake so that this can all be popped up too. And I'll just center this right. I kind of tucked it behind the sentiment banner a little bit so it's touching that sentiment banner. And then now's the opportunity to add other embellishments. So I took a couple more of those lollipops, made them look like they're popping out from behind the cake. I took some of those little tiny candies. I was going to kind of sprinkle them around at the top as if they were gems or sequins, but I actually just ended up adding some down here onto the sentiment banner, which I thought was cute. I'm adding one more candy here. I tried to use up all my candies. I didn't quite get them all used up, but I'm going to take these two big ones and add them inside. And of course, it's not finished without a little more glitter. I'm just adding some to all the candies that are plain cardstock because to me this looks like sugar and this cake is going to give us a toothache with all that sugary goodness. So here is my finished trick-or-treat cake with all of those colorful candies and that candy corn layered cake. I'm going to pull in the spooky cake and the pumpkin patch cake so you can see them all together, and I just love this trio of Halloween cake cards. So I hope this has inspired you to pull out that Build-A-Cake die set and make some Halloween cakes for Halloween. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye!